Welcome to Write to Publish, your go-to podcast for all things writing and publishing. I'm Karen Stanley, a 14 times published author and the founder of Mabel and Stanley Publishing. Join me as I share a multitude of tips and insights drawn from my own writing and publishing journey. We'll be hearing from some inspirational authors too, who will share their writing experiences and top tips for success. Each week, we'll learn about an aspect of writing, from composition to genre and from publishing to marketing. Listen in as we learn and chat about all things writing and publishing, and let's get you on the right path. Hello and welcome to another episode of Write to Publish with me, Karen Stanley. Lovely to have you all back listening in again. And this week, I wanted to talk to you about story arcs. Now, a story arc is basically the outline of your story and how your story flows. For anybody out there writing a novel or any kind of fictional work, or even perhaps if you're writing a memoir, it's going to have a bit of a story arc, isn't it? Because it's going to go from the beginning of your life to the end of it. But the story arc is all of the events that are in your story, how they fit together. And I've quite often talked before about rising and falling action. So every good story, and this is where the kind of the arc bit comes in, every good story will start at the very beginning. I think it was Mary Poppins that said, or was it The Sound of Music? Will start at the very beginning. And what you should have there in the beginning of the story is you'll be setting the scene. You'll maybe introduce your protagonist. You probably won't introduce your antagonist just yet, right at the beginning. And then what you'll have as you progress through your story will be your rising action. So this is where tension, events, situations start to develop. So, for example, if you consider a really simple story like Little Red Riding Hood, for example, the rising action there is we're starting to set the scene for the problem. Little Red finds out that her grandma is poorly. Mum says you've got to go and visit Granny. You've got to take her some apples, or whichever version of the book you read, depending on what she takes her. And you're going to have to go through the woods, and you're going to have to get to to Gran's house, and you're going to give her the basket of goodies to make her feel better, and then you're going to come back again. Now, that's the rising action. So this is when the problems, we've been introduced to the problem, we've been introduced to what the issue is and what that character needs to solve. And as we progress through the story right to the climax, which is the top of Story Mountain, if you like, that action is building. So Little Red, she packs the basket, she leaves the house, she walks through the woods. We're then introduced to the antagonist, which is the wolf, and he's hiding in the woods, again depending on what version of the story. There's a million versions of this story. It's been told throughout time for I couldn't even hazard a guess at how many times that story's been retold. But so she's going through the woods, and the wolf starts to track her, and the wolf starts to notice that she's there and is following her, is up to no good. And this is the rising action. And what we're doing in that story is we're building up to the climax, and the climax of the story is where the wolf is sitting in Granny's bed. He's locked Granny in the cupboard, or he's done away with Granny, again depending on which version you've read. Little Red gets to the cottage. She presents Granny, in inverted commas, with her basket, and then we have the whole, look how big your eyes are, look how big your teeth are, look what hairy ears you've got. And the climax of the story there is obviously Little Red discovering that the wolf has either kidnapped or eaten Granny and is masquerading as Granny. And then what happens then is the fall in action. So the climax is her bumping into the wolf and thinking, oh my God, he's going to eat me as well as the apples. And the fall in action, so we're coming back down the other side of Story Mountain now. So we started at the bottom, we've built the tension up to the climax of the story. Now we're going to start to work on the resolution, if you like, the fall in action, working towards the resolution. And this is how the story starts to neatly be resolved. So again, depending on the version that you've read, Little Red either defeats the wolf, or the wolf chases her, or the wolf eats her, or whatever happens, but it comes back down Story Mountain towards the resolution, towards the ending. Okay, so what you've got there, if you think about it, I'm waving my arms about quite freely as I speak to you. Obviously you can't see me, but what we've got there is a real arc of a story. It starts at the beginning, it builds up and up and up to the climax, and then it resolves on the other side. And that's your story arc, how the action builds to the climax and how it's resolved to the end. Whether that ending might be check out part 2, or whether that is a happy ending or a sad ending, or maybe what might come next type of ending, it's going towards some kind of resolution, and that is your story arc. Now, in a story such as Little Red Riding Hood, it's fairly straightforward because obviously it's a children's story, and it's unfair to say not much happens, but the events, it's quite simplistic, isn't it? The chain of events. Red goes into the forest, walks through the forest, encounters the wolf, defeats the wolf, goes home to her mum. That's really the story arc. When you start to write a novel, whereby you might have, 50, 70, 100,000 words, things get a little bit more complicated because your story isn't going to be as straightforward as that. I always liken this to if you watch an episode of Midsummer Murders, or one of those kind of cheesy, kind of cozy crime murder mystery type programs, or dramas that you see on TV, there will never be just a detective finds dead body, finds murderer, resolved. There's always more action that happens in between. Stories are very rarely that kind of linear, and quite often there'll be another murder will happen which will take the watcher off on a little bit of a different tangent, and more events will unfold in order to add interest to the story. It does make me chuckle because apparently serial killers are pretty rare, but in Midsummer they seem to be 10 a penny. There's never just one murder, there's more than one, but it keeps the reader, it keeps the watcher interested. So when you're writing a story of that magnitude, or whether you've got that much going on, obviously it can be quite tricky to keep track of everything. And what you don't want in your story is what we call plot holes, whereby you've said something happens and then you haven't taken the trouble to explain it, or you've forgotten that you wrote that has happened and you put something else in its place, or you've got a bit confused. So really, writing a good novel or a good story, particularly if you're writing anything like a murder mystery or any kind of historical fiction, you've got to really be careful about your story arc, that you've got enough rising action building up to the climax, even if there's some little kind of offshoot type of actions or little backstories that happen and bring you back to that rising action. You've got to be really clear about what that chain of events are as they lead up to the climax, and then you've got to be even more clear about what the resolution is, and that fall in action about how all of those ends get tied up, making sure that you don't leave any loose ends, or making sure that you don't leave any gaping holes, or there aren't any inconsistencies or errors in your story plot, because otherwise your reader will read it and go, well, she said this at the beginning and now suddenly we've lost a person, or we've gained a person, or something's happened that she didn't tell us about, or something has happened that she did tell us about and she hasn't resolved it, or he, or whoever the author is. So really your story arc is crucial. And I was having quite a long conversation with my fellow writer friend who writes historical fiction. I'm currently writing a murder mystery, and depending on when you listen to this podcast episode, I may or may not have finished it. Generally, I write chick lit, which is kind of rom-commy type, Bridget Jones style, satirical humour type writing. And I find that quite easy to write. One, it's my genre. I love reading it, and therefore it stands to reason that I love writing it. But it's fairly linear. It's kind of girl meets boy, girl hates boy, boy's a bit of a jerk, boy does something to redeem himself, girl thinks he's actually all right, they live happily ever after, the end. It's sort of a bit like that. People who watch or read rom-coms or chick lit, they're looking for that familiarity. They're looking for certain things in that genre. It's generally feel good. There's generally a little bit of humor. There's no really horrible surprises. Someone might die, but it's never normally as tragic as it might be. Those sort of stories people read because they want something from them, and generally they want a feel good, easy read. What my friend said you'd probably want to read on a sunbed when you're chilling out on holiday. So I kind of find writing that type of chick lit style fiction, I personally find that quite easy because it bobs along quite nicely. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't have a load of notes with sort of anecdotes and little backstories and funny events that have happened that I'll weave into that main plot. But my story arc, my story plot is generally pretty straightforward with a few little twists and life twists and turns along the way. Now, the murder mystery that I'm writing at the moment, that has proved to be a lot more challenging because, as is the case with most murder mysteries, if you want to keep your reader guessing, there's likely to be a couple of suspects. You sort of want your reader to think one thing, you want the policeman to think another, you want the main character to think another. You want to be that little bit of intrigue. You want to be a little bit of resistance, because otherwise, if it's blatantly obvious who did it right from the start, then that could be a bit of a dull read. But then again, you look at, like, I used to love Columbo. You knew who'd done the murder right from the beginning. That was really clever writing, because not you knew who the suspect was. You even knew how they'd committed murder, but the writing was actually about how the detective uncovered that. Very, very unusual and clever approach. However, even if you're doing it like that, there's lots of twists and turns and backstories that will be leading up to that main event, which is the murder, and ultimately it's being solved. And I was really struggling to write this in the new normal way that I would write one of my chick lit books. I'd sat down, I'd started to craft the story, and as is usually the case, the story was almost being narrated to me. It was flowing through my fingers onto the keyboard. The words were taking shape. I was really feeling quite pleased, and then I hit a wall. And the reason I hit a wall was because initially I wasn't entirely sure who'd done it, and I wasn't entirely sure how. So that took lots of long, lengthy discussions with my friend. And then also, I wasn't really sure how it was going to unfold. So what I've had to do is I've had to go back to the drawing board, and I'm going to write a really, really simple story arc. So a little bit more detailed than a plan, maybe just chapter headings, but literally a sentence or two about what happens in every single chapter. And what that means is then I can go back to the drawing board. I've done lots of planning. I know who did it. I know how they did it. I've got some backstories. I've done a bit of a verbal kind of brain dump onto the page, which is just me listing all of these events. But I'm still a bit worried about plot holes. I'm still a bit worried that I've missed events out, or that I'm not going to be able to bring the reader from the past back into the present all the time, which is sort of how my story is constructed. Now, that's just my story. There'll be lots of other stories that are constructed differently, but for whom these problems will be similar. So what I did, I worked with one of my clients who I'm mentoring at the moment, and what I've done, I've taken my own advice, encouragingly. I do listen to myself sometimes, and I'm going to go back to the drawing board, and I'm going to just write out my story arc. So chapter 1, so-and-so meets so-and-so. Chapter 2, so-and-so is arrested, questioned by the police. Chapter 3, we hear part 1 of so-and-so's backstory. Chapter 2, we go back to the police station, a new piece of evidence is found. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm basically going to chart every single thing that happens in that chapter. And what that will help me to do is look for any plot holes. If I say, right, chapter 4, so-and-so is going to find this piece of evidence, and it happens to be in a foreign country. And in chapter 3, I've neglected to mention that the person travelled to this foreign country. It's going to really jar with the reader, because they're going to think, well, how the heck this person ended up in Mexico? I didn't even know they were on the plane. Very simplistic example, but I hope you understand what I mean. I hope that makes sense. So if you are struggling with the development of your story, if you're struggling to kind of find your flow, go back to your story arc. And if you haven't created a story arc yet, I would suggest you do. Even if you're a pantser, and I'm pretty much a pantser, I'm sort of person, I love the story to flow. I love the story to guide me and lead me where it's going to go. I love to get creative ideas as I'm writing, but it's incredibly difficult, particularly with an intricate plot, to write that way if you've got nothing to hang your hat on. If you've got no idea who did this first, next, second, or last, if you've got no idea how this person fits in the story, but if they're crucial to that story, you need to know those things. So even if you've written it, and one of my clients actually came to me and she'd written the whole story. In fact, she'd written 7 books in this series. And when I read them, my feedback to her was, yeah, it's a great story, but it rambles a bit. It's a little bit slow. You've used a few too many words. There's a lot of padding in here. You know, the pace is wrong. It's a great story, but it needs work. And the way that we did that Well, she went back to the drawing board and she literally wrote out the story arc. She looked at every single chapter and she made a note of every single thing that happened in that chapter. And from there, she was able to say, do you know what? That is faff in that chapter. I'm just going to get rid of it. But in this chapter, I've forgotten to say how so-and-so met so-and-so. Really need to put that in. That's an important piece of information. So getting your story arc right at the beginning will save you from gaping plot holes, from kind of miscommunication between your characters, lack of pace, too fast a pace. It will just make sure that you've got a really decent framework on which to hang your story. So if you're partway through a novel, if you're just thinking of starting a novel, if you've finished it and now you're at the dreaded editing phase and having to go through it and you're feeling a bit stuck, at whatever stage you're at, look at your story arc. What does it look like? Is it cohesive? Does it show a really good progression of events, moving up story mountain to the climax, and a good kind of wrapping up of those events as we move towards the resolution? Does it flow? Have you got any bits in there that really jar, that don't fit the narrative, or that need explaining, or that need dropping altogether, or that aren't in there and need adding in? But this will give you, it's almost like seeing the web without all the flies in it. Terrible analogy, but I hope you understand what I mean. So if you're struggling, and particularly if you've hit a bit of a block like I did with my murder mystery, I just couldn't move forward. I had to go back, work out clearly in my mind who'd done it to whom, and got really stuck. We had a whole brainstorming session about alibis and how we were going to provide certain characters with them. So I've got all of that nitty gritty, that kind of inconsequential stuff that you might not necessarily tell the reader directly, but will be important to the construction and the composition of the story. So I've got all of that done. And now my next job is to literally just chart out my story arc. I might even write the points on post-it notes, and then I can move them around so that I think, oh, do you know what? I am actually going to put that bit of the story as a prologue. Really like the idea of that. And this bit of the story, I don't think the reader needs to know that until a little bit later. I think that needs to unfold. So I'm going to move that post-it note to a later part in the story. And then once I've got an arc that I'm really happy with, then I can start writing. And then I can sort of stop worrying about that, if that makes sense. I can just get on with the business of writing, embellishing, constructing, doing my show don't tell, doing all of my beautiful descriptive language, the scene setting, all of that comes next. But I'm doing it. It's kind of like I've got the foundations. Now I can build the house, and then I can dress the house with my faux fur and my wallpaper, if you get my drift. So story arc, hugely important. Make sure you've got that, and it doesn't have to be wordy. It can literally be 20 points on your mountain going up to the climax and down the other side. One thing worth noting is if you've got loads and loads of rising action, a climax, and then your resolution is really short. We used to do this with the kids in school all the time. They'd have this great story build up, great climax, and then we went home to bed. And it's like, that's fallen a bit flat because or I woke up and it was a dream. That's another favourite. So make sure that your story's balanced. Have you got loads of resolution but not much build up? Have you not created enough suspense in the build up to the climax of your story? So it really will show you how well balanced your arc is, what the pace of your story is like, and whether it's going to work when you write it, where your gaps are, and where your over kind of embellishment is, bits you might need to take out that the reader doesn't need. I hope that's been helpful. Please do get in touch if you'd like me to have a look at your story arc, or if you'd like some more help with your story arc. You can email me, Karen@mabelandstanleypublishing.com, or you can sign up to our newsletter and you get lots more tips and tricks and advice in that as well moving forward. And the link to sign up to the newsletter will be on the description, the podcast description, or in the comment section underneath. Hope to see you, or I won't see you, but hear from you all again. I look forward to chatting with you soon. Have a great week wherever you are. Take care, and let's get you on the right path.